the Ofsted premise seems to be that things have got a bit soft, a bit complacent, and that surely serves no one.
Well, I think that's right if that was true, but I would kind of counter by saying, actually, is the Ofsted inspection process in its current state fit for purpose in the modern world? And I think actually there's a lot to be said for when it comes to what we want from schools, when it comes to what we want for the next generation of children. Is the Ofsted process helping to deliver that? And I would argue that it isn't.
That it isn't?
Absolutely not.
So what do you think the purpose of Ofsted, the schools inspectorate, should be post the lockdown?
Well, I think this comes down to what we want from the next generation of children. If we think about, actually, yes, we want them to be knowledgeable, but we want them to be great citizens. We want them to be able to collaborate and to act creatively. If we think about the way the job market's changing, I think you mentioned a couple of weeks ago on your show, you had a teacher called Ryan, and you were talking about the kind of growth in AI and automation. Those are the way the job market's going. So if that's the way the job market's going, we want our kids to have a kind of wider range of skills. And if that's the case, then actually we need to think about how we are judging schools to deliver those outcomes. At the moment, we have a kind of spot check type of system, and that spot check basically puts a lot of pressure on schools in a kind of instant moment of time. And if we kind of think of an analogy of a football player, for example, it's like saying to that football player, "We're going to focus on what you do for 15 minutes," but that then creates a kind of an intense pressure for those 15 minutes, but actually nothing else for the remainder of the time. And perhaps a better way to think about these things is, how do we help schools continuously improve in a meaningful way and continually to do better for their pupils in an ongoing way? And is a kind of instant spot check regime the kind of best way to do that?
Yeah, but one step back, as Amanda Spielman herself said, kids only get one chance at education, and it's been badly disrupted for a lot of them over these last couple of years. And it is still the case that the number of children leaving primary school who can't read and write is staggering, and still at 16 many of them can't. Be a good idea to get that right before you started worrying about cultural values and Britishness, wouldn't it?
Well, I think absolutely, but it's whether the Ofsted process is helping the schools to deliver those outcomes or not. I think if we think about what the kind of pressure of Ofsted is doing, it's not helping kids learn, embrace an understanding of the world, to actually come out of school loving learning and wanting to continually do better. In fact, it's kind of creating a situation where they come away stressed and putting them off schooling altogether. So I'm not disputing the fact that actually we want to continually improve outcomes. We do want to continually improve outcomes, and we do want our schools to get better. But why is the Ofsted process able to deliver that? I don't think it is.
I would have thought that teaching standards are vital, but that's a very sensitive issue for teachers, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, we do need to have standards of teaching. I would argue that we probably need to have continuous kind of relicensing of teachers, perhaps, but we need to support that through ongoing professional development of teachers. But when it comes to how might we improve schools, I just wonder whether some kind of process in which actually we're encouraging schools, there should be, there needs to be a kind of an external kind of assessment. And I completely agree with that, but it's the way it's delivered. It's whether that assessment, it needs to be one that kind of creates an instant hit of pressure, or whether it's one that actually helps schools. Because at the moment, and some of the things we've kind of put in this letter are that at the moment, there isn't a kind of evidence-informed response to schools, which actually kind of says, okay, this is how you can change the steps you'll take, the kind of research base that's built on, and why those changes will improve outcomes. Ofsted reports are really quite short, and they're not necessarily helpful. And they're not necessarily helpful if you're a parent, understanding how you might, kind of challenge the governors or challenge the school to improve things. And so I think that's a real problem. If we really want to kind of work out how to improve what we do, then we need to kind of say to schools, okay, what is it we want to achieve? What's the goals? Where are we currently? What are the processes we need to put in place that are going to take us from where we are to where we want to get to? And how are we going to do that?
Chris Brown, good of you to join us. Thank you very much indeed. The thoughts there of Professor Chris Brown from Durham University. Also joining us is Barry Smith, founder of the Michaela Community School and the former head teacher of the Great Yarmouth Charter Academy. What do you make of Professor Brown's main point there, that essentially it's Ofsted that's not fit for purpose rather than some of these schools that have been downgraded?
It's a difficult question, isn't it? I think when we opened up this discussion, you mentioned Ofsted being all guns blazing. That's not at all what I read from the transcripts of what Amanda Spielman was saying. She was trying to be quite soothing, quite reassuring, quite placatory, I think, to teachers. But I think she's got a huge PR job on her hands. We don't historically, I mean, inspection started in about 93, I think. And historically, we've never really trusted inspectors to be objective. We've often worried about their subjectivity. Do they have an ideological slant? And so much time when we're preparing for inspections, and it is an incredibly stressful, time-consuming process. A lot of the questions are, will the inspectors like this? We're trying to second-guess the inspectorate. I think Amanda Spielman went her justification for saying, listen, kids have been very badly affected by COVID, lockdown, so on and so forth. We need to get back on track. We need to close those gaps as quickly as possible. The inspectorate will come in and will make sure that we're all moving in the right direction, and the inspectorate is there to help you close those gaps. That would be her argument. Whether the inspectorate does help close those gaps, that I'm more dubious about.
Well, when I say guns blazing, with Spielman saying the number of outstanding schools is expected to fall from over 4,000 to roughly 2,000, I would say that was guns blazing.
Well, look, I mean, some of those schools have been inspected for 10 years. There'll be different leadership teams. It's a different inspection framework. So you would expect change. Of course you would expect change. And of course what she was saying was schools were inspected, they were considered outstanding, and then they were kind of preserved in aspect, that status.
So the schools have deteriorated rather than the initial inspectorate having got it wrong. The reason I raise that is because
the criteria have changed as well.
OK, fine. But there are lots of reports doing the rounds as well, partly prompted by this letter, that the inspectors are poised to become a lot more ruthless, marking schools down, because what they really want to do and what the government really wants to do is drive the academy agenda.
But again, looking at what Amanda Spielman was saying there, I didn't pick up any of that from her. She was talking about 500 inspections that had taken place this term, I believe she said. And yes, there were some schools that had been downgraded, but there were lots of schools that had been inadequate or requires improvement that had been upgraded. So I don't think that's about the academy's agenda particularly. I do think there's an awful lot of pressure on head teachers. It feels like a sword of Damocles there. It's big, high stakes. If you lose your outstanding or good status, you're worried about your job, you're worried about the status of the school, you're worried about parental reaction. Obviously, as a head teacher who's part of a trust, there is pressure from the trust as well. So a lot of energy is expanded trying to think, look, who's going to walk through this door, what they're going to like, how can I please them? And that isn't necessarily the way to move education forward. Now, I wouldn't say that was the fault of Ofsted. I would say that is the fault of trusts and head teachers who are
absolutely
trying to second-guess Ofsted.
Yeah, a lot of people watching this conversation will think that's absolutely right and proper. The schools do need a good nudge in the right direction. Do you sense that the rocket may be coming from the DfE rather than from Ofsted? We've got a new Secretary of State, and crucially, we've also got a new schools minister. They're reading the Riot Act to Ofsted to get Ofsted to read the Riot Act to the schools.
I don't know if it's reading the Riot Act. I think post-COVID, governments, throughout the process of COVID, governments like to be seen to be doing something. They have to be seen to be reacting. They have to be seen to be putting their best foot forward, and perhaps that's what the government decision is there. These are very febrile times, and what head teachers are worried about staff absences, kids absences. It's a relatively new framework as well. So all of that, one pressure piled up against the other. Is this great timing to say, okay, we're going to launch new inspections? It's probably not a great PR timing, no. And as I said before, I think Amanda Spielman's got a huge PR task on her hands, but this predates her by decades.
So, final point, would you join forces with Professor Brown in saying perhaps it is time for a rethink of what Ofsted does and how it does it?
I think, yes, I think we need to think what Ofsted does and how it does it. I've got a lot of time for Amanda Spielman. I've got a lot of time for a lot of people who work in Ofsted. I think their values are right and their motivation is good. But the inspectorate somehow, or our reaction to the inspectorate, means that it isn't a vehicle for positive change very often.